In Russia, he is called the savior of a broken nation. In the West, he is remembered as the ghost of the Cold War. Both might be true. He stands small in height, yet tall in power. A man who rebuilt a country's pride and shaped its destiny for more than 2 decades. For some, he is the Iron Guardian who restored Russia's voice on the world stage. For others, he is the architect of fear, the man who silenced dissent and rewrote the meaning of democracy. This is the story of Vladimir Putin, the hero who became a ruler, and the ruler who may have become a legend of control. When Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin first appeared on Russian television screens in 1999, few knew who he was. A quiet former KGB officer from St. Petersburg, chosen by Boris Yeltsin to become acting prime minister, he seemed unremarkable. Calm, distant, almost invisible. But within months, Russia would know his name. Terrorist attacks shook Moscow. Chaos and corruption plagued the post-Soviet years. The young democracy was crumbling. People wanted order, strength, and dignity, things they had lost since the fall of the USSR. Putin promised all three. He spoke little, but acted decisively. His words were measured, his posture unshakable. He built his image as the antidote to the 1990s, a man of action, discipline, and patriotism. Cameras captured him riding horses shirtless in Siberia, diving into icy waters, flying jets, playing hockey, practicing judo, symbols of endurance and power that resonated deeply with the Russian psyche. To many Russians, he was not merely a politician. He was the embodiment of masculinity, stability, and pride. The chaos had ended. Russia had found its leader. By 2000, he was elected president. Moscow's skyline grew brighter. Wages rose. The ruble stabilized. Oil money flooded the economy. To millions, Putin delivered what they longed for, a sense of control. And for a time, the West too embraced him, seeing a modern, pragmatic leader who could cooperate with the new world order. But beneath the surface of that calm, a different Russia was taking shape. The early years of Putin's rule were defined by a single idea: centralization. The fractured regions of Russia, the chaotic media, the oligarchs who once ruled politics, all were slowly drawn back under the control of the Kremlin. The first to fall were the oligarchs. In the 1990s, they had become kings in their own right. Men like Boris Berezovsky and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who owned television networks and oil empires. Putin made an example of them. Berezovsky fled the country. Khodorkovsky was arrested and imprisoned for a decade. To the public, it was justice. To critics, it was the return of fear. Television, once loud and chaotic, began to speak with one voice. Independent journalists were silenced or disappeared. The press that had mocked politicians in the Yeltsin era now praised the president with ritual precision. State television turned Putin into more than a leader. It made him a symbol. In every image, he was decisive, unflinching, and patriotic. In every speech, Russia was rising again, strong, proud, unbroken. But behind the spectacle, dissent was shrinking. By the mid-2000s, opposition leaders began to vanish from mainstream visibility. Laws were introduced to regulate foreign organizations, NGOs, and media. Critics called it the quiet erosion of democracy. Supporters called it necessary for national unity. And so, two Putins began to emerge. To the world, he was a strategist, a chess player on the global board. To his people, he was a father figure, restoring greatness after humiliation. But for those who challenged him, journalists, activists, reformers, the price of opposition grew heavy. In 2006, Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who investigated human rights abuses in Chechnya, was shot dead in her apartment building. Her death sent a chill through Russian media. The message was clear: power was not to be questioned. Meanwhile, Putin's Russia was expanding its influence abroad. In 2008, Russian forces moved into Georgia. In 2014, Crimea was annexed. Each move shocked the world. Yet inside Russia, his popularity surged. The West saw aggression. Russians saw defiance. The image of Putin as a strongman, standing against foreign interference, became his political armor. The sanctions that followed were presented not as punishment, but as proof that the world feared a resurgent Russia. In this duality lies the power of Putin's myth. Every criticism from abroad only strengthens his standing at home. He mastered the art of political judo, using his opponent's force to his advantage. When Western leaders condemned his rule, Russian state media painted it as jealousy and hypocrisy. When protests erupted in Moscow, they were portrayed as Western manipulation. And through it all, Putin's control tightened. The laws grew stricter, the elections more predictable, the opposition smaller. In 2012, after a brief swap with Dmitry Medvedev, he returned to the presidency with renewed dominance. That year, mass protests filled the streets, but the Kremlin endured. Cameras captured Putin's calm face as he addressed the nation. "This is not chaos. This is democracy in Russian form." That phrase, "in Russian form," became a justification, a new doctrine. Russia would no longer imitate the West's liberal systems. It would define its own version of democracy, its own truth, its own destiny. The years that followed deepened the divide. New laws labeled independent journalists and activists as foreign agents. The internet, once open, became a battlefield of narratives. Every story had two sides, and in Putin's Russia, one side always prevailed. For the ordinary Russian, life improved in some ways. Roads were built, pensions paid, the state seemed stable. But freedom became an abstract luxury, something traded quietly for safety and pride. And pride, once awakened, is difficult to question. By the late 2010s, Putin's image was near divine in state media. He was the eternal leader, diving for ancient relics, taming Siberian tigers, flying with cranes. Each act, theatrical yet deliberate, reinforced his legend. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about mythology. The man had become a mirror of Russia itself, vast, complex, and uncompromising. But even myths have shadows. As the years passed, younger generations began to ask questions. What is the cost of stability? Who decides what truth means? From Moscow's boulevards to Siberia's frozen towns, whispers of discontent began to echo. They were met with arrests, surveillance, and silence. In 2020, a new chapter began, one that would test not only Putin's strength, but the endurance of the system he created. In 2020, as the world descended into a global pandemic, Russia's leader made his boldest move yet. The Constitution was rewritten, and with a few carefully chosen amendments, Vladimir Putin secured the legal right to remain in power until 2036. It was more than a political reform. It was a statement. The man who once promised to step aside now declared his permanence. Supporters called it stability, a safeguard against chaos. Critics called it the death of rotation, the end of accountability. For many Russians, it was simply inevitable. After 2 decades, it was difficult to imagine a Russia without him. But the world was changing faster than Moscow's walls could contain. In February 2022, the quiet chessboard of international politics shattered. Russian troops crossed into Ukraine. The West called it an invasion. Russia called it a special military operation. Whatever the name, the act marked the beginning of a new era, and perhaps the defining chapter of Putin's rule. For the first time in decades, Europe witnessed war on its soil once again. Cities burned, sanctions cascaded, the global economy trembled. Putin, defiant, stood before the cameras and framed it not as aggression, but as protection. Protection of Russian people, Russian language, Russian history. He spoke of encirclement, betrayal, and destiny. He framed it as a struggle not between nations, but between civilizations. Inside Russia, the narrative held strong. Television anchors spoke of heroism, not destruction. Children in schools wrote letters to soldiers calling them liberators. In the West, outrage mounted. Leaders denounced him as a tyrant, a dictator, a war criminal. And thus, the two images of Vladimir Putin crystallized, each feeding the other. To his people, he became the defender of the motherland, the man who dared to stand against NATO, America, and the tide of Western dominance. To his critics, he became the embodiment of oppression, the ruler who destroyed freedom abroad and suffocated it at home. The polarity was absolute, and within that polarity, his power deepened. Because in conflict, narratives harden. In fear, leaders endure. As bombs fell and sanctions grew, Putin's approval ratings at home barely wavered. Some whispered that he had succeeded in building not a democracy, but a fortress, a state where unity was forged through resistance. But a fortress can also become a prison. The war that was meant to secure Russia's greatness began to expose its limits. Thousands of young soldiers never returned home. The economy bent under sanctions. A generation of scientists, artists, and professionals fled abroad, searching for a future free from censorship and fear. Inside the country, repression reached new heights. Independent media outlets were shut down overnight. Calling the war a war became a crime. Citizens could be arrested for a post, a slogan, or a word. For the first time, the silence of fear felt louder than the noise of propaganda. And yet, Putin remained, calm, controlled, unyielding. To his supporters, this stoicism was strength. To his critics, it was detachment from reality. The image that once symbolized vitality, the man diving into the Black Sea or flying with cranes, began to feel distant, almost mythic. The real Putin, older, more withdrawn, was seen in carefully staged appearances, surrounded by loyal ministers and generals. Isolation became part of his legend. In 2023, the mutiny of Wagner mercenaries, a rebellion led by one of his own former allies, shook the image of invincibility. For the first time, cracks appeared in the wall. The rebellion ended swiftly, but it revealed something deeper. A system built on loyalty and fear can fracture from within. Still, Putin survived. He always survives. But survival comes at a cost. The price is trust. And history shows that even the most powerful rulers eventually face the weight of their own creation. As Russia tightened its borders, banned organizations, and silenced voices, it also closed itself off from the world it once sought to influence. Trade routes shifted. Diplomacy shrank. The nation stood alone, proud, defiant, and increasingly isolated. This was the paradox of Putinism, a doctrine that promised strength through unity, but delivered unity through control. To the eyes of the West, he became a relic of another century, a man still fighting ghosts of the Cold War. To many Russians, however, he remained the last protector in a world they believed conspired against them. Hero or tyrant, both narratives fed on each other, and neither could exist without the other. Because in the mythology of power, the villain and the savior often share the same face. As the years pass, historians will debate Vladimir Putin's legacy. They will speak of his rise from obscurity, his mastery of control, his defiance of the West, and the shadow of war that defined his final years in office. Some will say he restored Russia's pride, brought order to chaos, and gave millions a sense of identity after decades of disillusionment. Others will remember the prisons, the silenced journalists, the exiled voices, and the generations that grew up without knowing true freedom. Both will be right, because Putin's story is not only about a man, it is about a nation's longing for strength, its fear of weakness, and its endless struggle between order and openness. He once said, "Without power, there is chaos." But history might ask, what if power itself becomes the chaos? Every empire in history has wrestled with the same dilemma: how to balance might with morality, control with compassion, pride with truth. Putin's Russia is no different. It stands as both a monument and a warning. What happens when a leader becomes larger than the institutions he leads? He is a product of his time, and yet, he shaped his time like few others. Today, as the world watches Russia's path unfold, one question lingers. Will his legacy endure as a symbol of strength, or will it be remembered as the cost of fear? In the grand theater of history, power never lasts forever. Statues fall, borders change, legends fade. But the emotions they ignite, pride, anger, loyalty, defiance, remain long after the man himself is gone. And perhaps that is Putin's true victory, not in the battles he fought, but in the myths he created. Because in the end, myths outlive men. In Moscow, snow still falls over Red Square, covering monuments that have witnessed centuries of empire and collapse. Each flake settles silently, indifferent to the rise and fall of rulers. Somewhere behind the Kremlin walls, a man who once rode bare-chested through Siberian forests now governs through screens and silence. His power is absolute, yet fleeting. His control vast, yet fragile. He has become both the mirror and the mask of his nation, reflecting its strength, concealing its pain. And when future generations ask who Vladimir Putin truly was, perhaps no single answer will suffice. For some, he will remain the hero who gave Russia back its pride. For others, the tyrant who took away its freedom. But for history, he will always be both.